All right. I believe we are live. I sure hope you can hear me right now. I'm not going to lie to you. Not 100% sure, but I assume if that becomes a problem, somebody's going to let me know. Welcome to Lunch Break Apostasies. If you missed the introductory video from last week, I'd encourage you to go look at that. There's a few things we have to establish in that, and I'm just not going to be able to establish it all every single time we go through this class. So I would encourage you to look through that. Of course, I'm just a guy on the computer or the phone, not a cop, so you do whatever you want to do. Uh, Today we're getting into Hinduism a little bit here. And just as before, we're going to try to keep to some of the basic ideas from before. As we go through the various world religions and denominations that are going to pop up, we're trying to do it in a historical order. I also just remembered, by the way, I had a couple of you mentioning that I had a tendency to put my face behind the little box here. And last week that was supposed to be a whiteboard, but whatever I was writing on there didn't show up for whatever reason, so we're just using a PowerPoint this week. Anyway, we're definitely getting into Hinduism today. And Hinduism is definitely the oldest of these religions that we're looking into. Now, it should be said that as far as it goes, there's a little bit of competition with Judaism for that, but we'll get into that as we go ahead. Let's jump right into the material here. So, the history of Hinduism. The word Hindu comes from the Hindi word meaning to flow, and the root of the word Hindu is the same word that we get the modern day state of India's word from. Both of them are named after the Indus River, or the Indus River, I should say. And as far as the term Hindu being used to describe the religion of the area, we don't really see that until the Middle Ages. In fact, with Hinduism, honestly, it's not really strictly a single religion. Rather, it is several, hundreds, if not thousands, of local religions which happen to share a lot of attributes. And so the Muslim rulers of India during the Middle Ages, they would use the word Hindu to describe anybody who was non-Muslim. And then later, during the British Raj, which I believe that's about your 18th, 19th century, around that time, during that time, they were using the same word to describe the local religions within India. However, they would not include some of the other, what the Muslims would have considered non-Muslim religions, right? So, under the old system, things such as Buddhism, Jainism, Christianity, they might have called all of that Hinduism, whereas the British referred to anything that wasn't any of those larger understood religions as Hinduism. That sort of stuck, and we group it together just because they tend to have a lot of things in common. That being said, Hinduism has a lot in common with many other religions in the area. When we get to Buddhism, you'll see just how much Hinduism and Buddhism have in common. In fact, the theology of Buddhism is pretty much couched within Hinduism entirely. And Buddhism really doesn't concern itself with theology that much, so much as practical philosophy. And so, in some instances, people might not even see them as contradictory religions and maybe harmonious. But because of the nature of this, because there are so many different types of Hinduism, and this has been true of everything we're going to be going over, but especially here, you really can't pigeonhole people here because one person's Hinduism might be entirely different from his neighbor's Hinduism. There are 900 million Hindus in the world today, making it the third largest religion in the world, right after Islam and Christianity. Uh, Most of those are found, as you might imagine, within the country of India. However, there are about 1 million Hindus practicing in America right now. The symbol often associated with Hinduism is the Om, which you'll see on your screen. By the way, I recognize a lot of you are probably looking on phone screens and might have trouble reading the PowerPoint. It was originally designed to be shown to a very large audience. I tried to do a little bit of editing here, but you might have a little trouble with that. Hopefully, I'll get a little less wordy with the PowerPoints in the future, and it'll be a little easier to read. But certainly, you can see that symbol over on the right, which is known as the Om, and it is a symbol of the spirit world within Hinduism. The reason we say this one is the oldest is because we start to see it at around 1500 BC. Now, those of you who know your history real well might know that 1500 BC is also about the time we see Judaism pop up. But Hinduism appears to have been practiced in some form even before the time of the Aryan conquest into India. I should also mention, by the way, that's a little bit controversial to state that the Aryans conquered into India. There are a lot of modern historians who are now believing that it might have been some sort of peaceful transition of the previous Indus River Society to the Aryan Society, which eventually ended up defining modern day India. I find that a little doubtful, personally, just for a couple of reasons. One, it seems to me that the main argument that there was a peaceful transition from the Aryans over the Indus River Society is that there is little to no archaeological evidence suggesting that there was a war at that time. Well, I'm not going to argue that case, but I will argue the case that the uh, absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, meaning just because we can't find anything indicating there was a war at that time doesn't mean there wasn't a war at that time. Two, I am aware of no mass migration of human beings in history that did not come without some form of violence, at least if that migration is in the form of a replacement. I suppose it would be hypothetically possible for the Indus River Society, for whatever reason, to die completely on its own without any outside influence. But Occam's razor here says that uh, the one assumption that makes the least assumptions, the solution that makes the least assumptions, is that it was a violent transition of some sort. And then finally, I think there's a tendency towards arrogance of modern historians. Look, as far as history goes, the closer you are to the event, the more credibility you have concerning it. And the fact that it's only a very recent thing that people are starting to say this thing, which was understood for a very long time to have done happened in a certain way, I'm not saying that it's not possible for people to have gotten it wrong in the past, but what I am saying is that the burden of proof is on you to show that this was a nonviolent transition, and I just don't see that. Anyway, that's a uh, slightly ranting stage of it. If I pause for a moment, I'm just tabbing over to check to see if any of you have any comments or questions. And please, by the way, if you do, feel free to stop me. That's why we're here. Authoritative sources. When we're talking about authoritative sources within Hinduism, we have to understand, and this is generally true, by the way, of most religions. Don't think of it as authoritative in the same way as the Bible is authoritative to us. Yes, we're trying to follow the Bible, and we see it as commandments. As is the case with a few of these, many Hindus are not going to see the selection of poetic texts known as the Vedas as authoritative. They were written over a very long period of time, about 1400 BC to 1300 AD, and they cover a wide variety of subjects. And there are four different sets within the Vedas. They are written in the old Aryan language of Sanskrit, and often they might be chanted sections of them as mantras. Earliest texts seem to indicate that the early Hindu religion was very different from what we have today. Part of the reason I'm not covering many of the extinct religions or movements is because often there are still traces of them within religions we have with us today. Excuse me one second. That's one of the problems of going live. I thought I had that muted, but apparently not. Um, we have, what was I saying? There is traces of certain aspects of old religions that we still see today in certain religions, and Hinduism is one of them. When you look at ancient Hinduism, to me, it looks more like good old fashioned European paganism than it does Hinduism as I think of it. Right? When I think about Hinduism, I'm thinking about some of the gods like, Ganesha, that's that elephant looking one that we had in the first slide. I'm thinking about reincarnation. I'm thinking about yoga. I'm thinking about all those things. But when you look at ancient Hinduism, it seemed to be something very different. It tended to emphasize sacrifice to the gods, and the preferred animals to sacrifice were very similar to what you see out of paganism. For example, if you think about old Roman paganism, do you know what the best animal you could sacrifice in ancient Rome was? And the most common one to do so, at least in the main temples, it was a bull, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe a white bull tended to be preferred. That was the same thing in ancient Hinduism. The reverence that you think of for cows, for example, in Hinduism now, that still existed in primitive Hinduism, but the idea was not so much cows are sacred, therefore um, don't eat them, don't touch them, don't hurt them. It was more cows are sacred, therefore they're the best things to offer to the gods. That's something else interesting in this study that I found. Sometimes people will get the exact same bit of information and then come to the opposite conclusion. Take the conclusions of the Muslim versus the Hindu as far as the value of the pig goes. Both religions put low value on the pig. I'm not saying that either of them would be unnecessarily cruel to a pig, but neither of them think of them as a particular good thing. In the case of the Muslim says the pig is dirty, therefore don't eat the pig. The Hindu says the pig is not as noble of an animal as we look at some other animals. Therefore, it's okay to eat this one. And so you're coming from the same premise here, but getting a whole new conclusion. Well, in ancient Hinduism, you had an emphasis on sacrificing to the gods. And these gods were a little bit different than what we typically think of when we think of Hindu gods. I mentioned, Ganesha, uh, Brahma, all those ones. These ones look a whole lot more like the European pagan gods as well. Um, Gods are more towards like gods of fire, gods of fertility, gods of the ocean, right? You think of that with the Greek Roman gods, they had all of that. The Celtic gods, those were all there. The Norse gods, all those are there. Very similar looking set. And even in modern Hinduism, those gods still exist, but they have been de-emphasized in favor of these newer ones. The modern pantheon of gods uh, is famously enormous. Um, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of gods in Hinduism. And the reason for it is, we have to emphasize, Hinduism is not truly one single religion, but it is a description of the traditional religious beliefs of several different places, essentially one per village, sometimes even one per family. That's why you have so many gods within Hinduism, because much like ancient paganism, everything else is accepted, right? In the ancient world, it's not like I have my gods and your gods are false. It's I have my gods and you have your gods, and let's have our gods fight it out, and we'll find out who's the more powerful god. Both of them are still gods at the end of the day. That's what the ancient paganism looks like, and that's sort of how it ends up in Hinduism. That being said, there are certain gods that tend to be emphasized over other gods. You have Brahma, the creator. sort of considered to be the head god. In fact, these first three that we have here, they're in most modern Hindu traditions, they're the big ones and the ones you have most emphasis on. You have Brahma, who is the creator, Vishnu, who is the preserver, and then Shiva, the destroyer. And they are shown there in that image as the first three over here. There's an emphasis on a cyclical nature within Hinduism. And so the cycle goes something like this: Brahma creates, and during its lifetime or whatever it happened to be, Vishnu is the one that preserves it, and then eventually you have death, and that is when Shiva comes in. And this does not just apply to humanity, but all life, and even non-life, which is why it's not God, Brahma the god of birth, Vishnu the god of life, and then Shiva the god of death, but even something such as a planet is generally considered to be within the cycle nature of the universe, being created by Brahma, preserved by Vishnu, and destroyed by Shiva. Vishnu tends to get a lot of emphasis in a more personal nature. There are many legends in Hinduism concerning Vishnu, particularly taking the form of man, and many times it is supposed that he has taken certain avatars on Earth. Many times in an attempt to make Hinduism match up with other religions, Hindus might claim that Vishnu came to Earth in the form of an important figure in another religion. One of the most common is Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Many Hindus will say that the Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu. Many Hindus will say that Jesus Christ was an incarnation of Vishnu. But those are the three that are the most emphasized. After this, you have Ganesha, who is the god of luck. He's probably the most recognizable of the Hindu gods, as he's the one who has the head of an elephant. There are certain denominations within Hinduism which seem to place him in the highest place of importance, although that is not typical, but they seem to occasionally do so. I also might make note that those ones that tend to do that also seem to be the places um, in India that are most famous for elephant populations. Another famous god is a goddess, Lakshmi, if you've ever seen a picture of a Hindu goddess who has four arms, that would be Lakshmi, and she's the goddess of prosperity. One of the basic ideas within Hinduism, and as far as what is expected out of the practitioner, is the idea of karma. You might remember a TV show called My Name is Earl from well, quite a few years ago now. The basic premise of it was this: there is this white trash guy, just complete hillbilly, and you know what they say, you can't make fun of hillbillies unless you are one, and I are one. Uh, but he's scum of the earth. He just does everything he can to rip off his friends, his family, basically everybody he meets. And then one day he wins the lottery, and as he's celebrating the lottery win, he gets hit by a car. And as he's in the hospital recovering from this, and he lost the lottery ticket in the meantime, he's watching Carson Daly, and somebody comes in and starts talking about karma. They think that if they do good things will happen to him, and if they do bad things will happen to him. And he decides to start living his life based on this. And he has this whole list where he has to go and help people, and the more he helps people, the better his karma. And pretty soon he finds that lottery ticket again, and he's using that money to right all the wrongs he's committed. He's trying to get good karma so that good things happen to him. That's a representation of what people tend to think of as karma, but that's not really the Hindu teaching on karma. Karma really has to do more of a spiritual nature than a physical nature. And the idea of karma is reward, not necessarily in this life, but reward in the next life. And it's based on adherence to the Dharma, which is a set of principles. And Hinduism really kind of has an open canon, which somebody pointed out to me is an oxymoron. That's correct, but it does have an open canon where you have the rules can change a little bit. But to whichever rule you happen to adhere to, the reward in the next life you're going to get to is going to be based upon how well you adhered to the Dharma. So let's say my particular Dharma says I need to give to the poor. Well, if I'm not giving to the poor, then I'm not going to have a very good next life. Typically speaking, karma does not offer reward or punishment in this life, such as my name is Earl or popular culture would suggest. But it's all about the equality of the reincarnation. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is reincarnation? Well, reincarnation states that all living beings are in a constant state of samsara, or a wandering. And when a being dies, they are later reborn, not into a new spiritual world necessarily, but rather they are going to be born into the physical world once again as something else. The quality of what your next life is going to be is based upon your karma that you accrued based on your adherence to the Dharma. The Dharma also changes, by the way, based upon what you were in the previous life. Generally, the idea is this. However you start your life in the universe, right? You start, Brahma creates you. He creates you as something extremely humble, but something very simple. Maybe even a plant, right? But there's a good way to be a plant and a bad way to be a plant. Now, a plant, all you got to do is stay alive. So it's a pretty simple set of goals there, right? Um, if you're a good plant, you get to move up to something a little bit more difficult. It's sort of a celestial promotion system. And let's say, and this is all hypothetical, by the way. I don't know if a Hindu would put it quite this way. I'm just trying to explain it to somebody who would be coming from a viewpoint similar to my own. Um, but next time around, I have a new lifetime, and this time maybe I'm a dog. Well, being a good dog is a little bit more difficult than being a good plant. But if I'm a good dog, then maybe this time I come back around as a human. Not the very best of the humans necessarily, but a very humble human, which also means I have less responsibilities. Well, let's say I do a bad job adhering to it this time. Well, then I might get a little bit of a demotion in the next life, and so on and so forth. And you can go through all sorts of lives as all sorts of things. Animals, plants, even gods are a possibility within the Hindu system. Um, but the best thing you can be in Hinduism is a human, and not just any human, but a specific type of human. And we'll get into that as well. We mentioned that some of the other things are more desirable. It's extremely desirable, for example, to be reincarnated as a cow. Being a cow is supposedly highly desirable. I think I have a slide about that, so I'll mention that when we get there. The things that you don't want to be reincarnated, well, dogs, pigs, those are not considered all that great. And then there are also low-ranking humans that you don't really want to be reincarnated as. And so you might ask yourself, well, if this is the cycle, reincarnation, then what is the point of all of it? Well, according to the Hindu, the entire point of life is moksha. That is the release of the cycle. This is another one of these places where Hinduism and Buddhism, by the way, are going to merge for a little bit. The Buddhist wouldn't use the word moksha to describe the release of the cycle. They would use the word nirvana. But I'm hard pressed to find a significant difference between the two, because in neither case, it's not like you're going to heaven for all eternity afterwards. It is thought of more as a relief from the system. I don't have to continue this anymore. A very peaceful non-existence. It seems to be the consistent description of both of them. Now, because of this, you, might be familiar with the Indian caste system. the caste system, and when you look at the caste system, this is what essentially it looks like in India. And by the way, I should mention that this isn't everywhere in India, but they still kind of have to fight this in that country. And even today in America, there seems to be a fight for people not being discriminated on the basis of caste among Indian immigrants. And so this is highly ingrained into the culture, partially, and in fact, not just partially, but entirely, because of a flaw in the religion that states that certain people, if they come back in a certain way, it is because of what they have done in a previous life. The caste system can be broken down, and you'll see different versions of this. You might see a four version caste system or a five version caste system. But at the top of it, you have people ranked by which caste they are in. And, it's better to be in the top ones. The top caste is what is known as the Brahmins. These are your priests and your academics, and they are named, of course, after Brahma, the creator god. Right under them are the Kshatriyas, and those are typically physical rulers and also warriors. After that, you have the Vaishyas, and those are farmers and craftsmen. And then finally, you have Shudras, which are laborers. The fifth one that is often added in is simply called the casteless. You might have seen these before. These are also known as the untouchables, and these have the most demeaning, difficult jobs in society. One of the most common jobs for somebody who is without a caste is rat catcher. So it's definitely not something you want to be. Um, a couple observations of this. We don't know exactly when the caste system was put in place in Hinduism. It's not in the most ancient version of Hinduism. Like I said, the most ancient version of Hinduism looked a lot like European paganism. One of the ways it looked like paganism is there wasn't a priest class, there wasn't just a group of people, these ones are the priests, but it was usually women of the household who would do priestly duties such as sacrificing to the gods, which, by the way, once again, sacrifice is not very common within Hinduism. It still exists. Um, there is a goddess, I believe. Uh, the name is Kali Ma, and if that sounds familiar, I believe that's Kali Ma. I believe that's what's said in Temple of Doom. And there is a temple today that still accepts sacrifices. But for the most part, Hinduism doesn't really deal in sacrifices all that much. Um, but back in the day, it sure did, and it was the women of the household who were responsible for that. Once again, if you know a lot of European paganism, they had a whole lot of that sort of thing. Somewhere down the road, though, they end up introducing this caste system justified by karma. Look, if you're in this caste, it's because you did something in the previous life. You were a really good person in the last life. You deserve to be in this caste. Or if you're in a bad caste, you didn't do so good last time. Take your licks, and then maybe next time around you're going to be doing pretty well. Here's the thing: when you look at the castes, it might look really familiar to the system. If you're familiar with the medieval feudal system, you'll notice that's extremely similar with just a couple tiny little tweaks. What's the medieval feudal system? Well, you have your three group system, three estate system if you're looking in the French way, for example. And essentially, it's those who fight, those who pray, and then those who work, right? So those who fight, those would be your kings, your lords, your feudal lords. Those are ones who go and do the fighting, make sure everybody's protected. And then under them in the system, you have those who pray. Once again, in a medieval system, that's going to be looking like your priests, your nuns, your monks, those sorts of people. Typically, they come from royal or noble families, but are unable to inherit because they're not the firstborn or something like that, and so they end up going into priesthood. And then you have peasants, which is everybody else. Well, you'll notice that this system is extremely similar to that, except that we have split the farmers and craftsmen away from the unskilled laborers and making them two separate ones. But essentially, that's just the peasant class over here. And then this one puts those who pray at the very top, whereas the medieval system tends to put those who rule and who fight at the very top. But other than that, it's pretty much basically feudalism. And the justification at that time for a system in which you enslave essentially the peasants and which you have oppression and a total lack of freedom is this is what God wants, right? The divine right of rulers and that sort of thing. Well, the justification for this is exactly the same. It's a religious justification, and you got the exact same problem within it. As a side, since one of the goals that we have for this class is the ability to evangelize to these people, think for a moment, which of these people do you think would most benefit from hearing the gospel and which you think would be the most difficult? I don't know about you, but I would say it's probably that bottom on the list, the caste list, the untouchables, who would most like to hear about the gospel. You know, we have several missionaries in India. They tend to have a lot of success, and although this is my own fault, I haven't asked them so much about who specifically they're having success with, but I've sort of made the assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I made the assumption it's mostly been the poorest. Could you imagine being born into a system in which you are told from the very beginning you did something horrible in a previous life, and that's why you are where you are? And you can't do anything to change that in this life, but if you're really, really good at catching rats, maybe you'll get a chance to be the next one up again in the next life. So you just be good for now. How does that sound versus the Son of God Himself died a torturous death for you because He loves you so much? It had to happen not because of something you did in a previous life. You never had a previous life, but because of something that weighs heavy on your heart. He desires to forgive you. He desires to be reconciled to you. Which one sounds better to you? Now, if you're that top caste and you're the Brahmins and everything's going good, and you have the most responsibilities, and you have all of these important things, and adhering to the Dharma, it's so crucial. And hey, if you do this really well, maybe you'll get over to that moksha in your next life, or rather lack of next life. Maybe you won't be so worried about it. But to the people that society doesn't care about, Christianity sounds pretty good. Hey, thank you, William O'Kalo. Glad to hear you're following. Hinduism is also famous for having sacred animals, specifically the cow. In fact, there's a logical fallacy known as a sacred cow argument, and it comes from Hinduism. Hinduism looks very highly upon that particular animal. I read one Hindu source saying that the reason for this is because it is such a giving animal. It gives humanity milk, it gives leather, it gives meat. Didn't make sense to me because Hindus, typically speaking, refuse to eat beef, and so I don't know how you're getting leather and beef, but you can be getting milk, sure. Maybe it's because of the old, more primitive version of that. I should also mention that there are some Hindus, not all, but there are some Hindus who are entirely vegetarian. It might make sense to you. I wouldn't want to eat. I wouldn't want to eat an animal knowing that this might just be my deceased loved one either. So that's why you have that going on. Elephants are also considered pretty high up on the food chain. Dogs, pigs, rats, insects, those are all considered lower animals. Another common part of Hinduism is yoga. Now, yoga itself, when we think of yoga in the West, we tend to think of, that stretching that you do. That's not necessarily the religious practice of yoga, although it does come from the religious practice of yoga. That being said, I'm not preaching here against you going and doing your weird goat yoga thing or whatever it is you do. But you should be aware that it does have a religious origin and that it's possible to practice it in such a way which would be apostate, as is the point of the class. Yoga can be broken down essentially into four different schools. There is Bhakti Yoga. The point of Bhakti Yoga is that it is a show of devotion and is often including recitation of mantras. You know what a mantra is, right? It's when you say the same phrase or sentence over and over and over again. It's a meditation technique to help understand it. And so those practicing Bhakti do a bunch of things to show their devotion to Hinduism. Um, and it might be repeating the same phrase over and over, and maybe I'll understand it better or be able to meditate it on it better if I keep repeating it. You have karmic yoga. The idea of this is to focus on doing good things and to make certain pilgrimages, such as to Hindu temples or something like that. Jnana yoga is the practice of seeking knowledge, and so maybe my way of practicing yoga and practicing Hinduism is to learn more about Hinduism. And then finally, you have Raja yoga. One of these is not, by the way, included in many lists, and I'm just now remembering that, and I can't quite. I think it's that Raja Yoga that's not included in many lists of yogic practices, but some do include Raja Yoga, which includes meditation and discipline techniques. And I believe it's that Raja Yoga in which, once again, the picture you see over here tends to come from. Might be Bhakti Yoga, though. Um, the level of devotion to yoga is going to vary depending on who you are and specifically which caste. Many Hindus do not consider it necessary for everybody to be focused on this sort of thing. To many Hindu teachers, if you are casteless, one of the rat catchers, don't worry about this sort of thing. All you have to do is just be really good at being a rat catcher and worry about this when you come back in a next life and you're a little bit higher up on the scale. So naturally, those at the very top, the Brahmins, they're going to be very concerned with yoga. You have certain offices which tend to come along in Hinduism. You have priests. These ones are usually from the Brahmin caste. Once again, there's going to be different people practicing Hinduism in different ways, but these are typically from the Brahmin castes. They have the responsibility over presiding over rituals such as sacrifice and the rare occasion that happens. You might have heard the term guru before. That just means teacher. A yogi is somebody who has mastered a a particular practice of yoga. So of those four practices, that would be somebody who has mastered that one in particular. It is not somebody who is smarter than the average Hindu. And then finally, you have the Swami, which is a title bestowed upon prominent gurus. There are certain organizations and denominations and traditions within Hinduism, and some of them are more than just Hindus. Um, and if somebody is considered very high ranking as far as a teacher goes, then they might gain the title of Swami. And many leaders of movements within Hinduism gain the title Swami. If you see Hindu cults, which they do occasionally pop up, such as the Rajneeshis or the Hare Krishnas, usually their leaders are referred to as Swami or just any other organization under the umbrella of Hinduism. They might also be referred to as Swami. All right, that's our overview. Now, of course, Hinduism is highly complex, as is just about anything that we're going to look to. This is really almost purely introductory, to be honest. So, don't go out there thinking, now I know absolutely everything about Hinduism. No, that's just the surface to get into. And because it's so complex, people are going to practice it in so many different ways. It's really a waste of time to try to pigeonhole any time, but especially when it comes to Hinduism. The key points to understand from it are there are people who are displaced and people who are left behind because of Hinduism. These are the people that are going to be easiest to talk with, because when Hinduism gives them bad news, Christianity gives them good news. Um, I think that's about all I want to say on Hinduism. Checking real quick to see if we have any further comments. We do not. Of course, if you have any comments or questions and you're watching this later, and you can still comment it or send me a message, whatever you'd like to do, and I'll try to cover it before we get into the topic of next week's lesson, which is going to be Judaism. I hope to see you then. Thank you.